Hello, Year 12. Okay, so this video in itself is for your Module A study of language, identity, and culture. For the overall prescribed text, which is the contemporary Asian Australian poets. However, we'll be looking at one of the particular poems in that collection of poetry, which is Ouyang's New Accents. Remember, there are a few different poems we will be looking at, so this is just one of the videos to help you digest the context of the poem itself a little better, but hopefully also something for you to look back on when it comes to annotating the actual poem itself. So as I said, we will be looking at the actual context to start up this particular video. So we're looking at the composer's context as well as historical, social, and cultural context of the time. However, we will then go into the actual annotation process. So what you will need in front of you is something to write notes on. So whether that be a device, if you are more comfortable typing up your notes, or a pen and paper, which, that's completely fine as well. You will need to have a physical copy, or at least a copy of the poem New Accents as well, because as I said, we will be annotating, so you'll be scribbling all over it and making notes over it. So you can find that it is in the poetry booklet you were given at the end of term 4. Alternatively, it is on our Google Classroom, or if you just Google New Accents by Ouyang, you will find the poem. I recommend that you have obviously a pen in front of you as well if you're doing it physically, as well as a highlighter, because you want to obviously highlight specific parts when we finally get up to the annotations. Okay, so to start off, it's really important that you understand the context of the poem. Before we even launch into actually looking at the poem, you need to have a certain bit of background knowledge to really appreciate the ideas that are being discussed in his text. So to start off, the composer himself, Ouyang, was born in China in 1955. So he's Chinese native, which is obviously very relevant to what we'll be discussing. In 1983, he completed a bachelor's degree in English and American literature, and in 1989, he completed a master's degree in Australian and English literature. This was all while he was overseas in China. So already we kind of understand and we know that Yu himself is quite proficient in English. You would have to be if you were obviously studying a degree in English and American literature, as well as then obviously undertaking a master's degree in Australian and English literature. So he's very well read, very well educated, and he's clearly got at least bilingual at this point. So he's a native speaker of China, which would be Mandarin, as well as he would be quite fluent, I'd imagine, in English. Okay, so he migrated to Australia in 1991. He wanted to continue his studies, so he moved to Melbourne to study or undertake a PhD, a doctorate, at La Trobe University. So his particular field of interest for this PhD was representations of the Chinese in Australian fiction. So he's obviously got a fascination with, in this case, Australian literature, but he's very well read, as we've already discussed. This is very important that you kind of understand this now before we move into some of the ideas that he brings up in his poem a little bit later on. Okay, so the historical context, whilst it's not extremely important, it does provide a little bit of background knowledge that may be helpful to you. Okay, so in 1989, there were what's referred to as the Beijing Massacre or Tiananmen Square protests, where essentially it was there were a lot of students in China protesting against the government. In this particular case, a lot of students were murdered. They were killed by Chinese officials or Chinese government because of the protests. And since then, there has been a pretty wide repercussion for anyone who tries to protest, essentially, ever since then. So from this, it was quite a massive event worldwide. In response to this, the Prime Minister of Australia at the time, Bob Hawke, he allowed students, in particular, from mainland China and Taiwan to settle in Australia permanently. This is important because if we look at the actual figures of how many people were migrating to Australia at this time, and we'll get to that in a little bit, this was a really large, or there was a really large influx of Chinese migrants at this particular time. So this added to that increase in Chinese migration. In Australia, there was an extensive period of time between 1901 and 1973 where Chinese migrants were forbidden from immigrating to or migrating to Australia. And this is known as the White Australia policy. So very, very, very briefly, right after the gold rush, I suppose you would call it, in the mid-19th century, so about 1850 to about the very beginning of the 20th century, there was a lot of people coming from a lot of different nations around the world to come to Australia to pan for gold in hopes of obviously finding gold and becoming rich. To combat that, Australia created what is now known as a series of policies, in this case the White Australia policy, to forbid specific people from coming to Australia in an attempt to stop them from finding gold. However, there seemed to be a very keen focus on non-European migrants. In this case, there was a heavy focus on Chinese migrants. I will get to why that is relevant in a moment. It was only in 1973 that Chinese immigrants were allowed to enter the country, and anti-discrimination laws were created to reverse these policies which had existed. So although that might seem like a long time ago to you, we're looking about 50 years here, essentially. Just over 50 years ago, people from China were not allowed to migrate to Australia. There were really very few, if any, policies in place that stop people from discriminating against Chinese people because of their race. So you need to bear that in mind, because that has a very profound impact on Australia's social and cultural landscape. The way that people felt about Chinese migrants, the way that people felt about, this idea of the other, anyone that was not essentially a white Australian, and how that has led into the early 1990s, which is when this poem takes place. So if we move on to our next part here, we're looking at the social and cultural context, which is what I was just talking about. So the White Australia policy essentially promoted negative attitudes towards Chinese migrants, and this is apparent throughout Australian ideology during the 20th century. So, as I was saying before, non-European migrants, especially the Chinese, were considered, this idea of the other in a very Caucasian-focused society. So if you look just to the right there is a little bit of propaganda that was published in the Bulletin in Australia, with obviously this depiction of an Asian migrant. I believe it says the Mongolian octopus. So the depiction of the other, as I was just saying, and this kind of essentially fear-mongering of what would happen if we allowed Chinese migrants or Asian migrants to come to Australia. So obviously very hyperbolized, very exaggerated, with the intent to create this or demonize these people. So although the policy was abolished in 1972, these attitudes were easily carried into late 80s and early 90s as Chinese migration rose exponentially. So obviously after the abolishment of the actual policy itself, the amount of migrants coming from China rose to be about 7 to 8 times more than what there was prior to 1973. I will leave some government websites that do have the actual statistics for you in the link there, should you want to research that further. But in saying that, this gives us a bit of a better understanding about around this time when Ouyang was coming to Australia in 1991, there were still these attitudes, even though 20 years ago, before he came, they abolished this White Australia policy, these attitudes still linger. And this ideology and these ideas that existed in Australian society, whilst there definitely were still people that were happy that this discrimination was gone or was alleviated, there was still obviously a lot of people that still agreed that Australia should be kept white, and that anyone that was not white should not have a place in Australia. So we're going to very, very briefly just have a look at a clip from a 1962 ABC broadcast where they are speaking to people about the White Australia policy. So 1962 is about 10 years or 9 years before they actually... 11 years. I can't do maths. About 10 years, let's say that. About 10 years before they abolished the White Australia policy. But it gives us a little bit of insight. We won't watch the whole thing, but it gives us a bit of insight about Australia's attitudes towards non-Europeans at this time. And then we'll get into the actual poem.
Think of the White Australia policy?
Well, I think it's good, and they should really have it and keep out the coloured races.
You think even
yes,
now...
I think it's a little bit late for that. I think we should take Asians in. I don't think we can expect to keep Australia white forever. Well, I shouldn't think, because the coloured races, when they get into a white country, then they want to intermarry, and I don't think it's fair on the children. And I don't think at all that they should allow coloured races into Australia.
The White Australia policy, well, I think you have to live in a country with coloureds before you can decide upon it. People here don't live with Aboriginals, do they? But in New York, they live side by side with coloureds. I come from New York, and I wouldn't care to have them living in the same house as me.
Well, I suppose everybody should have the same rights in this world. In what respect?
Well, do you think it should be discontinued at this stage, or...?
No, I don't. I think it should be continued.
Even more forcefully, perhaps?
Even more forcefully.
Why is that?
Well, I believe in the way things are at present. When you take into consideration what's happening overseas, in South Africa and those places, we seem to be very well off here.
Do you think we can keep it this way for long, with the tides and forces running at the moment?
Yes, I don't think there's any reason why we can't. If everybody takes a proper attitude towards it, because I don't think we could have anything else but a White Australia policy.
Well, it's most misunderstood overseas. I think it has its good points. It should be more thoroughly explained to people so they can appreciate the problems involved, rather than just say White Australia policy and that's it.
What do I think of it? I think it's very good.
But you'd see it kept in force?
I would think so.
Why?
Oh, well, I have no particular reason.
Obviously, we're not going to watch that whole thing there because it does go for another 4 or 5 minutes. However, I will leave that link in the description below if you would like to watch that further. But as I was saying, this kind of supports our ideas that at this time, there was a divide in people's opinions about overseas migration. And unfortunately, even though the White Australia policy was abolished around 10 years after this film or this report was done, these ideas and attitudes were still very much prevalent. So this brings us up to the actual poem itself. So what I would have in front of you right now is the actual poem, because we're going to be going through it line by line. And now that you've got a little bit of context about the composer and as well as the actual time period, hopefully some parts will make a little bit more sense to you. Okay, so I'm just going to bring this across here so it actually fits on the screen. Okay, so... okay, so we're going to start off obviously with the first line itself. It's really interesting to note that the poem itself is broken up into quite small stanzas. We'll come back to that in a little while. But I think it's really interesting that the actual title of the poem itself, so New Accents. It's almost like this is obviously a direct reflection of Ouyang Yu's experience himself. Maybe this idea that people are coming into contact with him and they're noticing that he has obviously a new accent, or meeting new people with different accents themselves. So there's obviously some indication there about the idea of being foreign or being different, because that's essentially what an accent indicates. So what I do recommend is, as I'm going along here as well, you're making your own notes alongside what I'm doing. Okay, so, and forgive me if like my keyboard is thumping in your eardrums. I do apologize. But here we go. Okay, so So even obviously the title of the module we're looking at is language, identity, and culture. This title itself has a very clear connection to that. New accents, we're referring to someone that may be different, someone's culture. Obviously the language they speak is directly in connection to the idea of accents, and somewhat as well your accent has a direct correlation to your identity in some way too. Okay, so if we start off with our first stanza just here. So in Kingsbury in the late 1990s, the people I met constantly spoke English with new accents. So to give you a bit of an understanding here, Kingsbury is, and we're going to put that in green, Kingsbury is a suburb in Melbourne. So Kingsbury is right next to La Trobe University. So this obviously makes sense considering that Ouyang attended La Trobe University. So we'll pop that there just for our own reference. Okay. And I will try my best to color code these so it makes a bit more sense. Could even try out a little, there we go. We love an arrow. Okay. All right. Okay. In the late 1990s, obviously this gives us a bit more context. I'm just going to bold it for now. I might even highlight it. Obviously we know contextually what was happening at this time. I'm not going to write it all out again, but I will just, for your own reference, pop down our cultural, historical, and our social context. Just to bear in mind, we're looking here at the 90s. He obviously arrived in 1991, but he's obviously stayed since then. So we're looking at from the very beginning of the 90s up until the late 1990s. Okay, the people I met constantly spoke English with new accents. I think it's really important here that we acknowledge the fact that he is using a personal pronoun here. It is always important to realize, I think for my techniques, I'm going to put them in blue. We can't always assume that the speaker of the poem is the actual poet themselves. Most likely this is being written from Ouyang's own experiences, but in this case we could still refer to the speaker. So when I say the speaker, I'm not always going to be talking about Ouyang or the actual composer, but in this case the speaker is using a personal pronoun, which, you know, there's a few different reasons you can use a personal pronoun, but I believe probably the strongest one is it creates a connection. It's a personal pronoun. There's some sort of, this is his story. This is, or his or her, this is his story. So there's some sort of personal connection to it. It almost invites us to maybe empathize or maybe relate to the story that he is telling. So also have personal pronoun as our technique. Creates a personal connection between the speaker and the responder. Okay, pop that in blue, and whack our little, oops. A little arrow there too. Okay, great. Okay, obviously the idea of new accents again kind of harkens back to what we were just talking about. This idea that you know, everyone that he's meeting has these new accents. So this tells us that at this time, if we're thinking about Australia's cultural landscape, there's a variety of different cultures being introduced here, especially in this area in Melbourne. So I'm going to link that back to our green here, our beautiful green. So this is giving us an insight that Australia's cultural landscape is diversifying. There are new cultures, accents, however you want to say it. And this indicates the growth in Australia's growth as a multicultural society. Okay. All right, so our second stanza, we've got P from Wuxi spoke of once travelling down a street in Melbourne I'd never heard of that's called Nicoson Street, or Nichoson Street. So this is obviously a commentary on some of the different people that he met. Wuxi is a city or a province, I think, in China. So I'll add that there just for my own background information. We'll say a location in China. I think it's a city. Again, feel free to fact check me if you would like. So Wuxi. Once traveling down a street in Melbourne, I'd never heard of. That's called Nichoson Street. So we've obviously got, if we go on to the next line as well, kind of go on with a very similar idea. But we've obviously got a word here that's spelt wrong. And if anyone is familiar with the streets of Melbourne, this is in reference to Nicholson Street in Melbourne itself. So the actual poet is deliberately choosing to spell the word wrong in an attempt to kind of mimic that accent or that mispronunciation of English that may be so common for a non-English speaker. So what we can call that, there is a specific technique that we're going to refer to for this one in particular. It's what we call solecism. So essentially it's when on purpose a composer has, misspelt something or used incorrect grammar. In this case, it's to replicate that struggle potentially that non-English speakers have when it comes to learning this new language. So okay. Okay, so we've got a second technique there. Pop it here. And I will just also highlight that. So what you should be trying to do right now is something similar. You don't have to do it exactly like I do in terms of my annotations. I do like to color code a little bit. As I said, you may have heard me before, I would like to keep the techniques the same color. So if I'm looking back through my work, I can easily look, if I'm just looking for a technique, I can easily find it because I know it's color coded to that particular color. Some people don't always work that way. That's fine. And as you can see as well, I'm trying to match up the color green to anything contextual. Okay, so we're going to move on to... we're going to move on to the next two stanzas. Okay. I'll move this across. Not sure why it's doing that, but whatever. Okay. All right. So C from Canton, which is another city in China. So I'll just quickly jump back here for 2 seconds. Saves me writing it all out again. So C from Canton, and obviously these letters that they're using, P, C, etc., are in place of a name. Okay, we'll just grab one of these. Okay, the C's from Canton talked about criminal cases. You got that alliteration there coming through as well. I'm not going to pop it down, but feel free if you'd like to. Canton criminal cases, as if they were crime minor. And the best contribution he has made to the English language was when he said, when I first arrived in Australia, they tried to fool me around because I couldn't, and we'll go on to the next stanza in a moment. I almost feel as if, I am actually going to add something in here about the alliteration, because this alliteration here, this hard C sound that's being created, Canton criminal cases, it almost speeds up that particular line. There's a rhythm that's being created within the line that makes us, want to read that a bit faster and with a bit more rhythm. which is immediately slowed down here through this truncation of this particular word here, criminal. And actually, you would have heard me when I just said it then, I fumbled on it myself. It's forcing you as the reader to actually stop. There's an awkward, almost pause that's being created there through that kind of contrast between that fast Canton criminal cases. And then it forces you to stop. It breaks that rhythm. It breaks that flow. So, I'll just pop these in here. We could argue that the use of, comparing or contrasting, alliteration and this truncated word is done on purpose, in order to create that awkward feeling and the awkward flow, maybe to reflect that struggle again that we're referring to about learning this language and how difficult it is not only to learn a language but to learn English in particular, because it is a very challenging language for non-English speakers. So we could argue here, alliteration, it's actually encouraging the reader to increase their pace. There is a rhythm created in this line. Whereas this truncation, or this like separation of the words themselves, it's forcing you to slow down. It's forcing it to be a bit awkward. So it creates an awkward wording almost. Almost like my descriptions here. Creates an awkward wording, slows the reader down. This replicates the struggle that non-English speakers may face when using English. Oops. Okay. Whack our arrows in. Okay. All right. I want to also... I forgot to write here. Canton, I think, is now more commonly referred to as Guangzhou, I believe. So I'll just pop that in here as well. I think it's current. I probably butchered the spelling here, but please forgive me. All right. So, and the best contribution he has made to English... Obviously, we're cutting down to the next stanza here. Language was when he said, when I first arrived in Australia, they tried to fool me around because I couldn't, blah, 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 blah. And we're going to get into that in a moment. I really wanted to pick up on this particular line here because, interestingly, the composer himself has chosen to create a break here, has chosen to move on to the next stanza. And if you remember what we've looked at in class, we refer to this deliberate break in a line or deliberate break in some sort of sentence or clause as enjambment or enjambment, however you want to pronounce it. There's a variety of different reasons. But again, I can't help but feel like this is done on purpose to create that awkward wording again. It's forcing us to stop our flow. It's forcing us to feel a bit uncomfortable with the way that it's written and the way that we say it. Again, maybe to reflect that awkward struggle that many non-English speakers would be going through, obviously trying to navigate their way through an English-speaking society. So we'll highlight these, but that deliberate break, it could have kept going if it wanted to. It could have just said, made to the English language was when he said, but it doesn't. It forces us to take that breath. It forces us to break, which again... creates an awkward wording. So we're calling it enjambment, whatever you want to call it. Creates an awkward wording. No. Forces a break. I don't want to use the word break again. Forces a break in the line, encourages the reader really to take a breath. This creates an awkward, almost uncomfortable feeling when being read. This could reflect the same uncomfortability that non-English speakers feel. Okay, clearly can't spell uncomfortability. Is that a word? Ability, uncomfortability. Yeah. Oh, no. I think I just made up a word. I'm going to leave it. Feeling this could create the same uncomfortable feeling. Let's do that. Okay. Okay, so as we go on, when I first arrived in when I first arrived in Australia, they tried to fool me around because I couldn't speak Anglish. So we're going to move on to our next line. And it's doing it again. So if we come back here, sorry, very, very briefly, they tried to fool me around because I couldn't, next line, speak Anglish. So again, there's that use of enjambment being used right here. And then I'll start here, speak. So again, there's that awkward break happening in the actual poem. And we can argue that it's to reflect or to create maybe even a sense of empathy for the people that he's talking about, for him. And this idea that, you know, it's a bit of a struggle to use this particular language. Interestingly, you know, he's used the direct quote here that we can obviously talk about. If you wanted to refer to that as a direct quotation, that's fine. You've got, this is what someone's said. But more importantly, it's a little bit ironic because if we look up the actual definition of anguish, we're referring to something that is painful or something that is mentally or physically taxing on someone or creating some sort of suffering. It's ironic because obviously he's saying the word English incorrectly. It's almost like a pun. It's a play on words. But this is, again, directly reflective of his experience of trying to maybe learn this language or use this language, especially in this society where if you have an accent or if you are not using, you know, English properly, you can be, you know, completely grilled for it. And you can be made to feel like an outcast and made to feel like an other because you don't fit in. So it's ironic. Again, he's using solecism, so he's spelling something incorrectly on purpose. I'll let you write that down. But it's ironic because he's learning a new language, experiencing a new culture, and it is painful. It is definitely a form of anguish for him. There's severe mental, physical suffering that he goes through because of his experiences. Oops, I want my, there we go. Okay. All right. And again, you could take this further and you could refer to this, like go beyond the literal meaning even more so and refer to the fact that this connects to the experiences. Experiences of Asian migrants in Australia at this time. So not only the fact that they are, you know, the idea of learning a new language is difficult and trying to communicate with people that may not understand you is difficult, but also the racism and the discrimination that a lot of these people would be facing at this time because of, you know, historically what we've seen with the things like the White Australia policy and Australians' attitudes towards immigrants, especially Asian and Chinese immigrants. Anguish. Yep. Great. Okay, so let's see. Okay. What a wonderful word, anguish, that I've spent all these years laboring on with myself, with my students. Some of them would say vegetable. Others would accentuate the B in subtly. And I myself unashamedly once pronounced whore as whall. So again, you've got this use of solecism. Although in this case, it's a little lighthearted, what he's saying here. So you've got your solecism. Again, that's that use of deliberately spelling something wrong. Although the tone of the poem itself shifts a little bit here. He's being a bit playful with it, what he's talking about, especially that last line, whore as wall, I'm going to say. Whore. Never said that word in my life. So you've got solecism. The tone of the composer has shifted to a more playful, more humorous tone. So he can see the humor in it. He can absolutely see the humor in, learning a new language and maybe mispronouncing things and that being a little bit silly itself. So it's a light, humorous tone, the funny side of a new language. However, when we move into our next stanza, which I'm about to do, our last two stanzas, this tone changes back. So he says, spoke of the antipodes like antipodes and lost my MA candidacy in Canton because I created e-sense in essence. And they, professors rightly, lost a genius in me with their English and my anguish. So let's just break down a couple of these words to begin with. So antipodes generally is referring to Australian natives and New Zealand. But the actual term itself is in reference to the idea of opposites. So, that'll be green. We'll do that one in. So if we're looking up, actually, I'll put it in red. So you've got a definition. We haven't done red. So if we're looking at the actual definition, it may refer to Australians and New Zealanders, or people from New Zealand. But can also refer to the opposites, or refer to opposites. So upon reflecting this kind of entire idea that's being communicated in this poem, we could argue that this is, again, furthering that idea of the other, and that people who are coming from another country who are non-English speaking are considered opposite. So if we go back all the way back up here, I'll just refer back to this really quickly. This image that was, broadcast during the 20th century to Australia, you've got that idea of the other still. They're completely different to us. They're opposite. Is that idea not, again, shown within this poem? And it's interesting that he's used that particular word because it could still be conjuring that imagery of being opposite or being the other. So imagery is created about the idea of the other, non-English speaking individuals being opposite to English speaking. It could go even further, and it might even refer to literally white versus non-white, essentially. Okay. So you got that parallel between the two. Okay. And again, obviously, this is your solecism being used again. Feel free to use it, but he's doing that on purpose, But again, very clearly contrasted to these previous two stanzas. This is a light-hearted, playful tone that's being created. This is now taking a bit more of a serious tone. We're going back to that serious tone. And this is where maybe we could still argue that this antipodes, this word in particular, although it does mean this, it could be referring to this divide, this clash, this conflict between these two types of people in Australian society. Okay. Lost my MA candidacy in Canton. So he lost his master's degree candidacy basically because he created essence in essence. So essentially because he misspoke or missaid something. He was punished for it. So we're going to write here. So the speaker, and this is where, it makes more sense that this speaker is the actual composer, because this is what actually did happen. But the speaker is punished for not speaking English correctly. Sorry, I'll fix this. This could be reflective of people in Australian society being punished, in a sense, as in exiled or forbidden, like we've seen in history, or even just discriminated against because they don't speak English properly, or because they're from a different country. So we'll put exiled, forbidden, outcast, discriminated against, etc., because they don't speak English properly, or they are the other. We'll leave it at that. And he basically goes on to say, and they, professors, rightly lost a genius in me with their English and my anguish. So essentially saying, you know, this bad thing has happened, and it's a loss for them, actually. They've lost me. So he's creating this sense of self-empowerment, saying these, you know, referring to himself as a genius. I think it's also very interesting if we refer back to just this line here. Actually, sorry, I'm getting sidetracked. What color will I make this one? Let's go with red. This idea of self-empowerment is kind of coming through here. It's really interesting, this line just here, because I created essence in essence. There seems to be like a value placed on the English language, especially in Australia. I think you might disagree, but in recent years there has been more of an acceptance to people who don't speak English in Australia, but it's still very, very much nowhere near where it should be, in my opinion. If we think about even just our own schooling system, for example, there's no real need or push for people. I think Australia is one of the only countries in the developed world that don't learn a second language as in terms of it being compulsory. Obviously, we've got options to learn things like French and Spanish at our school, but it's not compulsory that you learn that. Whereas I believe in New Zealand, for example, I'm not sure what the exact name of the language is, but there is a push for students to understand Māori language, for example, or from my own personal experience traveling to Vietnam, some of those places encourage English language because they know it's valuable. So there seems to be this value placed on the English language when it almost seems a bit very narcissistic and self-centered to think that English language is the most valuable language, when in actual fact, if we're really thinking about it, the most people in the world speak Mandarin. That's the largest speaking language in our world. So it would make more sense for people to learn that. But, you know, and it's interesting because a very minor blunder, like saying essence instead of essence, has lost something valuable to him, which is his master's candidacy. So this is, again, just this whole thing here, again, is just another struggle that that non-English speakers must face. And you can take this for what you want. You could refer to this as maybe it's a metaphor for this these experiences that non-English speakers have in terms of possible racism that they may go through or may face. But essentially we're seeing definitely a shift in the tone again. So it's gone from that lighthearted back to that very serious sense there that English for a lot of people is anguish, and for that it means it's suffering. It's not a fun time. It's very difficult. Okay. All right, so what we're going to do now, because obviously that's the end of the actual poem itself, is I'm going to ask you, and I might pop the questions on our Google Classroom, but you should have for me now, hopefully, a fully annotated poem. And I'm going to have a few questions that I will be either posting on Google Classroom, or we'll have some sort of quiz in class next time I see you, based on this poem. So I hope that this is helpful. I know that sometimes normally we would be doing this in class, but I thought maybe flipping it a little bit and having this recording might be a little bit more helpful for you. And hopefully it's something that you come back to as well when it comes to your trials and obviously your HSC. I apologize for you having to listen to my voice for 46 minutes. But hopefully this has helped you and has saved a little bit of time in class as well. Please do let me know what you think, if there's anything that you think I missed out, or if there's anything that you may think that I should add, because I'm definitely open to your feedback. But I hope it's been helpful, and I will see you in class. Thank you. Goodbye.